I want to say welcome again, and I'm speaking for myself and Nancy Flournoy, who is chair of the Ingram Olkin committee since we began back in 2018. Let's see if I can advance my slides. There we go. We formed this forum committee and named it Statistics Serving Society, and attributed it to Ingram Olkin, who had a passion for both the field of statistics and for the impact of statistics on society. Here's some of his thoughts. Statistics are beautiful, powerful, can make a unique contribution in service to society, and are cross-disciplinary. And Ingram was one of the inspirations for the founding of NIST more than 30 years ago. The focus of the forums is to address a societal issue that might benefit from attention from the statistics community, and that's certainly what we're hoping to do today. So our goals are to bring innovations in statistics to new research, accelerate development of innovative approaches, develop statistical action items to inform public policy and generate reliable evidence, and facilitate new collaborations between statisticians and stakeholders. We hope we can achieve some of that today in our breakout session. Very briefly, we had an inaugural forum back in 2019 on gun violence, the statistical issues. Shortly after the COVID struck, the pandemic changed the world, and we've had a number of events, mostly virtual, unplanned clinical trial disruptions, COVID in the schools, algorithmic fairness, police use of force, and advancing demographic equity with privacy-preserving methodologies, which was just held last month in person. So we're attempting to get back in person, and keep an eye on our events page. Police use of force will be another event this fall in person. And we're hoping to do something on the opioid crisis. But today we have statistics on combating human trafficking. And this is the opening forum. We hope to have an in-person follow-up after we learn what we can learn today. And I want to just say the organizing committee, David Banks, Daniel Monique Valier, and Megan Price are with us, and I'm going to now, without further ado, hand this off to David Banks to introduce today's session.
Thank you, Jim. Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming to this webinar. The genesis of this idea was a National Academies panel that was held in early 2019, and its purpose was to examine statistical methodology for estimating the prevalence of human trafficking. And many of the panelists interacted in that forum, and the ideas have continued to roll forward since. And our general hope is that this is yet another stepping stone along the way to better interaction between statisticians and the domain scientists who study human trafficking issues. And to sort of frame some of those issues, we're very fortunate to have Margaret Henderson, a faculty member from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Nancy Hagan, who is on the North Carolina Commission for Human Trafficking. I guess it should be North Carolina Commission Against Human Trafficking. So with that type of intro, I would like to hand it off to Margaret and Nancy. Thank you.
All right, sorry for my pause in unmuting myself. I was fiddling with the share slide function. So I am a practitioner working in an academic environment. Nancy is an academic who has been doing practitioner work. Let me check in right here. Can you see the slide okay? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. So whenever we do this sort of presentation, we call it sort of a human trafficking 101. We know in the audience there is a broad range of understanding about what human trafficking is. And there's probably some myths and misinformation in the room. So we're challenged to both condense a whole lot of information into a 30-minute presentation and to hit the middle of the road in terms of guessing what your understanding is. So be patient with us if we don't quite hit the mark, and go ahead and ask any questions that you want to ask us. Nancy, do you want to say anything by way of introducing yourself?
No, I'd just like to thank everyone for inviting me to participate. As Margaret said, she and I try to reach across the sometimes great divide between academia, stakeholders, advocates, and populations studied and served. And we do this across the state of North Carolina, and to some degree at the national level as well. We're going to raise a number of issues and concerns are regarding research and its application, with the intent of, again, bringing us together to have a shared vocabulary, set of constructs, understanding, so that we can move forward and really get an idea. My goal, as someone who did leave academia and moved into policy and advocacy work, is to always center the survivors, the folks who have the lived experience of trafficking. I think Margaret would probably share that. We're just coming at it from different ends, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Okay, let's get started. Our learning goals here are to just share some basics. We're going to define what sex and labor trafficking are, recognizing that different countries have different definitions in place. We're going to learn a little bit about the typologies, that is, how it shows up, what the business models are. We'll learn a little bit about the indicators of trafficking, and then something about response as well. But bear in mind, this is a once over lightly coverage of a very broad topic. And then as we go along, we're going to begin to identify challenges to research design, to data collection and analysis, knowing, again, that y'all are going to go into that much more deeply in the small group sessions later on. So here's what we know. Basically, the question any community should be asking is not, does trafficking happen here, but how does it happen here? It happens anywhere there are vulnerable people, and it really doesn't matter what the nature of the vulnerability is. Traffickers are predators, and they look for people with vulnerabilities that can be exploited, and they're easy to find. They are in all of our communities, and it also could be any of us at any given time. We know that traffickers are highly adaptive and nimble, and that's everything from being able to move from community to community to community, to being able to change their business model, to being able to take advantage of new markets or new opportunities to advertise their wares. They work quickly, and they can evolve faster than community response or interventions can evolve, or that laws can evolve. So they are one up on us. The anti-trafficking field in the United States, it's young. It's only 23 years old. And we've only been talking about domestic victims of trafficking for that long. And that was with a passage of a significant piece of legislation we'll talk about in the next slide or two. So we haven't been in the business all that long. And we still are just beginning to call it what it is, use the actual terms that make an act human trafficking, as opposed to talking around it or using other words for it. We tend to soften a lot of the vocabulary because it's just too uncomfortable. We use, for example, the word John instead of sex buyer. So the field is young. It's very inconsistent from place to place to place and profession to profession to profession. It shows up differently in different communities too. And it's not consolidated. People respond differently in different communities. The data aren't consolidated. The data tend to be fairly unreliable. They come close at it. They make a run at it, but they're not accurate or comprehensive, and they're fragmented. So there's not an enormous database that's anywhere that shows the totality of trafficking. In North Carolina, for example, we get very good law enforcement stats from particular law enforcement agencies, but not consistently over the state. Some hospitals might be very good at documenting the data they find through their screening, but not all hospitals. It's very fragmented. So the best we can do is get glimpses into the problem as it exists. Here's the law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Again, just the United States law. It's when we began to address domestic victims of trafficking, and involves one person exploiting another person for the purpose of labor or commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion. That's a phrase as you see often, force, fraud, or coercion. And Commercial Sex Act is defined as any sex act on account of which anything of value is exchanged. So it could be a place to stay, it could be food, it could be something else entirely. People ask me, what's the difference between trafficking and other kinds of exploitation? And my unlegal answer is, in trafficking, if the person tries to get out of the situation, something bad will happen to them. They can't just walk away from it. So that's one way to think about it. Nancy, what do you want to add about the legal definition of trafficking?
Oh, thank you, Margaret. Just a couple things. To back it out a little bit to the international perspective, the United States is quite distinct in that we require an act, a means, and a purpose in order to define a transgression or the crime of human trafficking, even with labor and sex exploitation of a minor. And so other countries do not need to demonstrate the use of either force, fraud, or coercion as a means of compliance when a minor is involved in labor or sex trafficking. The United States says, okay, we agree with that in terms of sex trafficking. A minor is a child, is to be protected, cannot give consent to engage in commercial sex. And yet with labor, we make the distinction that an individual under the age of 18, so legal age of majority, must be compelled through force, fraud, or coercion to engage in labor transactions that are exploitative for the profit or benefit of another human being. So something of value has to be exchanged in both cases, sex and labor, but with sex trafficking of minors in the United States, the distinction is no force, fraud, or coercion need to be demonstrated, nor does there need to be third-party involvement. So we don't, to pick up on the vernacular, there needn't be a pimp or a trafficker or a predator. And this really impacts, of course, what we see and define as human trafficking, how we study it, how we determine policy and our response, as well as how we serve survivors.
Thanks, Nancy.
Yep.
So here's some of the descriptive phrases that can help you delineate between force, fraud, and coercion. If you pay attention to Hollywood, it's all about force, right? It's about kidnapping and explosions and a whole lot of violence. The concerns on social media are often about, the scary white van and people being snatched out of parking lots and that kind of thing. And it's simply not accurate. It's not to say those things never happen. It's just, they just don't happen to the degree that popular culture might have you thinking. So often, labor trafficking, for example, is going to start out with fraud. There's going to be the advertisement of the job that's too good to be true. There's bait and switch tactics and promises about where you'll go, what you'll do, how much money you'll make, how much fun you'll have doing the work, perhaps, in some forms of it. The tactic might switch over time. So if, for example, somebody is fraudulently recruited to work in a carnival, first it starts out with the bait and switch, and then it becomes coercive somehow, like maybe somebody's driver's license and phone are confiscated. Maybe they are kept off balance by being given drugs all the time. Maybe there's other kinds of verbal coercion going on. And it could be that if they actually tried to leave, force might be employed. You know, traffickers will use what it takes to keep a person in place, so it can accelerate over time. With sex trafficking, again, popular culture says it's about the white van and scary people recruiting people online. No, actually, it's about somebody building trust with a victim and becoming important to them, tapping on their vulnerabilities, convincing that person that they're important, they're seen, they're loved, and then it becomes manipulative over time. There may be control of documents, there may be elaborate systems of reward and punishment that you might see in other kinds of dysfunctional relationships or abusive relationships. It can vary widely. And it can be difficult to actually pick from when one strategy shifts gears, you know, from fraud to coercion to force. It's not always really obvious, but this is one way of making you think about it. The important thing is to know that in the United States law, these acts are mentioned, they're critical to building the cases, and they can change over time. They can escalate or be adjusted to meet the demands of the situation. Nancy, want to add anything?
Just that if we're talking about hidden populations here in terms of folks who are trafficked, we're also talking about sort of insidious and hidden mechanisms for that trafficking. And so as Margaret notes, it can be really hard both for the individuals involved and certainly for law enforcement or researchers to distinguish what are the mechanisms of control. And they're built into, typically into the relationship between the exploited individual and the person who is committing the exploitation, and perhaps the purchaser of the results of that exploitation. It's very, very hard to delineate. And so that's one of the tasks that we have.
Right. Thanks, Nancy. So as I said earlier, traffickers are predators and they target vulnerabilities. And it really doesn't matter what the source of the vulnerability is. And it doesn't matter if that vulnerability appeared yesterday or generations ago. It's just the fact that there's a vulnerability and it can be exploited. So I'm not going to go over all of these other than to say some of your research might actually use the vulnerability as the doorway to begin your exploration. That may be how you can tap particular populations to collect data on. With some of these vulnerabilities, it's multidimensional. So just for example, with natural disasters, I could be the person whose house and whose job blew away yesterday in the tornado, and suddenly I'm economically vulnerable and I need a place to stay, and somebody exploits that. But I could also be the guy who's looking for work and he gets recruited by a work crew that goes to the site of the natural disaster. And then I'm exploited and trafficked by doing labor to rebuild following the natural disaster. So that's just one way of saying these are not one and done or cut and dried examples, that they happen in multiple venues.
And one framework that we often use in the United States to look at these textured vulnerabilities is the socio-ecological model, where some vulnerabilities may be particular to the individual, others are familial, social, structural, community-based. So we look at these intersecting arenas and impacts that play out within these forms of exploitation. It can be really helpful to just to frame the complexity in that way.
I think I also want to make the point that if you are anything other than a full citizen in the country in which you're living, you are vulnerable. So you can be someplace on a work visa or a study visa, and that makes you beholden to a particular employer or sponsor, and those relationships can be exploited. Now, here in the United States, we're lucky enough to have the National Human Trafficking Hotline. A lot of countries don't have a parallel organization, and its sister organization is Polaris. And basically what Polaris does is make reports out of the data that comes through the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So this gets quoted a lot. Their reports, their data gets used by a lot of folks here in the United States. And it's very useful. However, it's also flawed. They collect their data by the calls and texts and emails that come into them. So I could be a victim asking for, how do I get help? Or is what happening to me really trafficking or not? And that gets counted. Or I could be somebody who says, I've been seeing something weird in the back of this restaurant where I go to all the time, and I'm a little concerned about the dishwashers who live there. And that gets counted as well. So it's a broad range of informational and direct experience calls that come in. So you have to be careful with how you use that data. Still, it's also really, really useful data for us to begin to understand the dynamics of trafficking in the United States. Nancy, anything you want to add?
To reiterate that the data that's collected here is not academic in nature. It's not a reliable sample. It's the respondents, if you will, are self-selected. So it's people who choose to call the hotline or text or email, as Margaret said. It's a slice, it offers insight, but that's the extent to which we can use this helpful body of information to inform our work, but not to rely solely upon it.
But if you're beginning to build your knowledge about human trafficking, I do encourage you to go to the Polaris website in particular and read some of their reports, because it is very good background information.
Yep.
For example, they used all of those calls to identify 25 different business models of human trafficking. So a lot of us will think of some of these automatically, like escort services or panhandling and begging, maybe that kind of thing. But we might not necessarily think of landscaping crews, of people who work in nail salons and spas, of folks who clean our offices at night. It's really quite broad. And the unifying elements are that the populations are vulnerable somehow, and they are easily overlooked. So it could be somebody we see so regularly we don't pay any attention to them, or somebody we don't see at all, like the cleaning crews who come to our offices. Nancy and I did some focus groups with local government staff here in North Carolina, and we just simply asked a broad array of employees if this was going on in your community, who in local government might see it. And we found out that local government staff might be in positions to see 19 of these 25 different business models. And the people who pick up trash and garbage and recycling might see just as much as the people who are first responders. So you really can't guess who's most likely to see something until you begin to explore the model further. Nancy, any comments you want to make?
Well, the models are emergent and I think Margaret used the word previously, nimble and always changing. Polaris initially created this typology through an aggregation of, I think, 4 years of data, and they're continually, annually revisiting their data and their calls to, again, determine whether these types are still operant and what new types may be emerging. It's dynamic.
In your research, you might want to consider what kind of professional roles are most likely to intercept with any of these business models. For example, health inspectors might intercept with people who are trafficked in restaurants, labor trafficked in restaurants, and use that point of interception as the basis for your research model. Nancy, why don't we switch here and you start telling them about what actually shows up in terms of force, fraud, and coercion.
Okie dokie. Remember, we talked about the act, the means, and the purpose. And again, force, fraud, and coercion are the means of compelling another human being to engage in either commercial sex or forced labor for something of value. And these data hearken to the 2021 results of Polaris's phone calls, texts, and emails. Again, remembering that these are self-selected participants, respondents, or individuals who've called the hotline. The hotline operators do more of an educational interview rather than a true screening. So they're not like some people may be familiar with departments of social services, which often use the vocabulary, talk about screening in or screening out. That is not Polaris's role. Polaris is trying to determine whether there's credibility to a call and whether exploitation may or may not be occurring. They then refer the respondent, if the respondent wants to be referred, to either law enforcement and or a service provider. And so it's dependent upon the caller's desire. But in 2021, as determined through those educational interviews, it was found that emotional abuse was the most dominant way of compelling another person to engage in commercial sex or forced labor. Again, as Margaret said, that's coercive. So emotional abuse. Before we started the webinar, we were talking with one of the participants about young children. Young children have probably manipulated every single one of us on this call through some sort of emotional manipulation. If it's a meltdown in the candy line, if it's a temper tantrum about going to bed, one more story, whatever it is. We're human beings, we're emotionally engaged with others. It's very facile for one human being to manipulate another. With that said, we often use, and I would refer you to the power and control wheels. If you're familiar with those through domestic violence and sexual assault, their means of, it's a visual depiction of the mechanisms that abusers often use to control their partner or the person that they're engaged in an intimate partner relationship with. There is something called the power and control wheel around human trafficking as well. And you will see a number of elements or aspects or types of emotional abuse depicted there. It can be really helpful. Economic abuse was the second most prevalent means of controlling someone. We in the West live in a capitalist society, we have to have access to some sort of income or means to financially sustain ourselves. If another person inserts themselves into that process, either by paying low wages, no wages, controlling our access to a job through illicit recruitment fees, or holding our passport, or if the immigration system ties our employee to a particular employer. Again, these are means where someone can insert themselves and manipulate another. Threats. We see all sorts of threats, some that are emotional, some are physical. They may be threats of reputational harm. Anecdotally, when we talk about the illicit massage industry in the United States, where typically the person who is being trafficked is a female from either mainland China or Korea. The cultural manipulation, appropriation, and abuse can occur where the reputational harm of that person in the threats of saying, I'm going to tell your village, your mom, your family, what you did when you were here in the United States. There's no need to lock the door or restrain someone. It's enough to have that kind of power over another human being. So all of these need to be taken within a cultural context as well. What may manipulate me may not another individual. Isolation. I came to this work in part through a lot of direct service with farm workers who are primarily Spanish speaking, but some speak indigenous, what they would call dialects, I would say languages. In rural North Carolina, the farms are by nature isolated, physically, geographically. There may or may not be any access to web-based services. And until such means as WhatsApp emerged, the person might as well have lived on the moon. And so it's very, very easy to control someone when you have that kind of physical sense over them. And then denying needs and wants. 14% of people reported this. Again, remembering that this is all self-reported data. So again, and it helps me to think of instances. So I'm hopeful that sharing these are helpful to you all as well. Denying needs and wants, we often see quota systems where, especially with sex exploitation, if the trafficked person does not bring in a certain amount of money on a particular day and meet their quota, they may not be able to take a shower, they may be denied food, they may be restricted from access to a mattress. The trafficker has control of their fulfillment of needs and wants. So now I'm going to have to say next, Margaret. Thank you. The Polaris also identified a significant change in the pandemic years between what they had seen previously in terms of recruitment types, who's doing the recruiting and who currently is doing the recruiting. So during the pandemic, remembering that people were often settled in their home, unable to move. We talk about isolation, we talk about restriction, we talk about limited boundaries, where there was a rise in prevalence of family members or caregivers exploiting others. So this is a myth-busting data point where Hollywood, Liam Neeson, others would love to have us think it's the stranger danger. It's the stranger in the white van that's plucking a human being, often a child, a domestic-born child, into, often the default is to sex trafficking, because we also forget that human trafficking encompasses labor and sex trafficking and organ selling. But in the United States, we focus on labor and sex. But it's really what we're seeing is that the dominant type of person who's trafficking is a family member or a caregiver. Again, we go back to coercion. Coercive elements and techniques are often built within relationship and trust. So a family member or a caregiver, a neighbor, an intimate partner, and an employer may have a pre-established relationship with a person that they then exploit, where there is some conferred level of trust or domination or exploitation that's pre-existing and built upon.
And Nancy, if I can interject here, I think it's important to note that what we know about familial trafficking has really emerged in just the last 5 years. And in part because we haven't been asking about it appropriately. Some screening tools initially would ask about intimate partners, for example, being the person who's trafficking a victim, but they wouldn't ask about other family members, and particularly not parents. So it's how the whole field is evolving. Thankfully, now we're beginning to ask more of the right questions and more comprehensive questions about who might be doing this. And the picture that is emerging is very different from what folks thought 20-something years ago. Anything else you want to say about employers, Nancy?
Again, an employer holds the ticket to a person's livelihood, and especially in terms of immigrants or folks who may or may not have documentation or legal standing in a particular country, that employer not only holds a ticket to their livelihood, but also to their status, their legal status in the country, and that's very easily to manipulate.
And those employers too may not look at all like any stereotype we hold of what traffickers are, who they are. So I could be the professional woman living in a big home, doing my professional job, and I hire somebody to live in my home to take care of my kids, but it becomes exploitive after a while. I get their documentation, I add more tasks to their responsibilities. Pretty soon that person is working 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, and isn't allowed to go outside the home. I'm a trafficker, and I look like I belong in the junior league. So stereotypes get busted coming and going in this field.
So there are a number of challenges to research design and data collection, which is the whole point of this webinar. But I just wanted to bring a few to light. One is that there are a number in the United States of distinctive, we have federal law, the TVPA, which we said was first passed in 2000 and has been renewed several times. But even given that federal law, we are a country of 50 very disparate states, and state law may vary significantly from one state to another. So the legislation and policy act hand in hand and may look really different depending on the terrain. Another challenge to research design and data collection are the sampling techniques that we use. And I know we're going to have a longer session on that. Again, this is a hidden population. How do we interact with hidden populations, often through proxies or other professionals or some sort of respondent-driven sampling, chain sampling, and that has its benefits and limitations. So we're talking about an inherently isolated population, and so sampling techniques are quite restrained. One aspect to that restraint is that victims and survivors often do not identify as such. So a person can be describing their life experience, even say they reached out to a service provider or perhaps law enforcement or a friend or a pastor or an acquaintance. They're describing their lived experience, and they may or may not identify that as exploitation, much in particular exploitation that rises to the degree of human trafficking, remembering those three elements that have to be present. And so a person may think, this is the worst job I've ever had. Or, I frame something as a situation of domestic violence. Or think that they're normalized behavior. Well, everybody's working at age 12 in my community or culture or neighborhood. It's just what you have to do to get along. And in part, I think people don't identify as victims or survivors of trafficking. And we use the term in North Carolina, at least, of victims to refer to folks who are still in the situation of exploitation, and survivor or someone with lived experience as a person who has left that situation. And we center the individual. So if the person is using the term lived experience or survivor, that's what we go with. But basically the demarcation is still within the situation of exploitation or out of the situation of exploitation. I would say that victims and survivors do not identify as such, in part because the phrase human trafficking means nothing to most people. And that includes researchers and policymakers, but perhaps in particular to folks who are experiencing exploitation. It's a relatively new phrase. We, in the United States, often distinguish between chattel slavery, transatlantic slave trade, the historical heritage, legacy, and burden of that we carry in the United States. I know that other countries don't sometimes may use the term modern slavery or modern day slavery or slavery in a way that many of us do not. I'll own it. I don't in the United States. But I have stood in a number of fields in North Carolina where an adult man has said to me, typically in Spanish, I am a slave, soy esclavo. And so again, we center survivors, the language that they use, but is where they identify themselves, but often do not identify as a victim of human trafficking or survivor. So this can be really hard when we're trying to research. We have limited access to primary data. Most of our data are secondary. They're either reports that someone made to someone else, be it law enforcement or an advocate or Polaris, but access to individuals in situ is really challenging, in part because of gatekeeping as well. Advocates and feel strongly, typically, about the communities with whom they work. They may or may not trust others, in particular researchers. We've been in academia. We know that there's our challenges to participatory research. There are challenges to action research. There are challenges to not plucking information from individuals, taking it and running with it. So I think there's a growing movement around gatekeeping, at least in my experience, where professionals and folks who may have access and may serve as conduits or informed key informants to people with primary experience may be withholding that. And so again, that's a reliance on secondary sources. Margaret, have you found similar challenges or?
Well, this is certainly closer to your field than mine. I can't emphasize enough the gatekeeping function. Every service provider is hardwired to protect their clients.
Yep.
So figuring out how to meet those interests while gathering data is a delicate dance. I do want to check in. I realize we're about at the end of our time.
We're at time.
Do you want us to go ahead and wrap it up, David and James, or?
If you can do it quickly, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Okay. Well, and you'll all have copies of these slides, but I think the point Nancy could make quite elegantly with this slide is that these topics blur. Things exist on a continuum. It can be really difficult to distinguish when one act starts and another one stops, right? So that's part of the challenge of you doing this work. And we're happy to talk this out with you at any time. Some data is industry specific. There's a fair amount of data on illicit massage industry, still not enough, but there's some. Some data comes through particular types of functions. A report like this will have information about particular processes, federal prosecutions, but nothing else. So again, it's a glimpse into that world, but it's not a complete look. And Nancy, could you tell them briefly what this report provides?
Sure. There's an annual report that's created by an organization called Shared Hope International in the United States, and they focus solely on domestic minor sex trafficking. So again, we see types or sample groups. There may be a interest and advocacy around that particular sample and nothing else. So we don't have comprehensive data is the basic point.
It is. And
similar here. Yeah. Same. Yep.
North Carolina stats, but it's incomplete. But at least it gives us something. It gives us that glimpse. Nancy, online advertising?
Online advertising, we are working with a number of researchers in North Carolina who are scraping data sources, including online advertising to compile information. And I have recently identified 319 IMIs in North Carolina. I would say that changes every hour. So data are not static and not always reliable.
So we will wrap this up knowing that you've got our contact information, and we'll be with you for the rest of the afternoon. So please do get in touch, and we're glad to share what information we do have with you in any way that might be useful.
Thank you very much, Margaret and Nancy. That was terrific. If you look in the chat, you'll see that there were a couple of questions. I tried to field them, but if you would like to add your responses later on in the session, that would be great. But now it's time to move on to my good friend Tyler McCormick from the University of Washington, Seattle. Tyler, are you ready to take it away?
I am, yes. Okay. It's now going without me though. All right, so thanks a bunch for the opportunity to chat with you all. I think that Margaret and Nancy, that sort of your overview and presentation there, I think hits a lot of topics that we'll talk through in the next half an hour as I go through these slides. So I'm going to talk a little bit about responder-driven sampling, which is one sampling technique that people use. I think my assessment of the literature is that it's a relatively a newer technique in this particular area. So it's something that's been used in other contexts with populations that are difficult to access with traditional surveys for some time now, but I think there's a lot to do in terms of understanding the potential utility here. So I'm going to talk through the basic plan for what I have laid out is to talk through a bit of respondent-driven sampling at a high level, just to give a sense of familiarity with what the sampling technique is going to do, how it works, and then how it might work in the context of trafficking. And I'll just say the caveat here is that, just like all of the, just like any sampling technique or any way of thinking about reaching or learning about individuals in these populations, it's not going to be a one size, right? It's not going to work in every situation. And so the other thing that I hope comes out of the next 30 minutes is a sense of when this might be a reasonable technique. And I think there's a lot of directions and a lot of more thinking to be done here. So, all right, with that preface, so respondent-driven sampling starts with a convenient sample of people in the target group. So this is a big advantage that if you have individuals that you interacted with, maybe through a previous intervention, or maybe they have an ongoing relationship with a public service agency, then those people could, won't be representative of the population overall, but are relatively easier to access, and maybe because of sort of built up trust, to place a group of individuals that are more likely to engage. So respondent-driven sampling starts with a convenient sample of the target group and then encourages group members to recruit other people. It requires participants to be socially connected. So a key feature of respondent-driven sampling is that individuals in the target population are recruiting other individuals in the target population, the target group. And it also means that people need to have some autonomy over their mobility. There are other assumptions too in terms of the statistical methods, but this is kind of the main sort of contextual assumptions that are requirements that we have, that people are socially connected and have some autonomy over their sort of ability to move and interact with other individuals in the sort of group of interest. It provides access to members of the target group directly, which is sort of in contrast to some other sampling data collection techniques, and can be advantageous, especially if we're trying to learn about sort of broader questions about sort of experiences or sort of types of situations that people are in. Having access to members of the group directly can definitely be advantageous over some sort of indirect sampling methods. So it's frequently used in studies of sex and labor trafficking, along with studies of related groups, so sex workers or undocumented migrant workers. And I'll give a couple of examples of that later on. So just to kind of ground some terminology here, there are a lot of sort of a few different related methods out there, and so I'm just going to kind of set up some terms here at the beginning to try to sort of unify that a little bit. So chain referral sampling is a general term for a method that sort of traces a respondent's network as a way to recruit the person. So basically the recruitment is happening through the network that the respondent has, the connections that the respondent has to other members of the population. Snowball sampling is a chain referral method that was originally proposed as a way to learn about sort of network features, but again sort of falls under this category of a chain referral sample where individuals are recruiting each other through their network, through the people that they know. It starts with a probability sample of respondents and then traces their networks. And then what I'm talking about today, respondent-driven sampling, is sometimes called a non-probability snowball sample because it starts with a convenient sample and then respondents choose the network members that they recruit. So just to give a bit more background sort of on how common respondent-driven sampling is, this is a review paper from 2021 in the Journal of Human Trafficking. And so this is an analysis of 44 studies from the previous literature. And so you can see that this is broken down by a number of different characteristics, but in the blue box here at the bottom, you see that there's a breakdown by sampling strategy. And so we have probability samples, which are samples that sort of try to enumerate a sampling frame directly, and then sort of take random samples from the sampling frame. We could talk about sort of how feasible that is in different contexts. Again, I think going back to Margaret and Nancy's point that they were talking about a very, very homogeneous, heterogeneous, not homogeneous, the opposite, a very heterogeneous set of circumstances and situations here. So of these 44 studies in this review paper, 17 were probability samples, 14 were mark capture or sort of capture recapture, sort of matching across multiple data sources type studies. 7 were respondent driven sampling or link tracing, which is what we'll focus on today. 1 was time location, and 6 were other. And again, these 7 that were respondent driven sampling have sort of particular features. And I'll mention this in more detail, but you can sort of see, you can sort of think about if you're trying to do a sort of national estimate, a national level estimate of sort of population size, respondent driven sampling is going to be very hard to do in that context, right? Because the sort of recruitment is going to be primarily local with people because it's happening through people's networks. So respondent driven sampling tends to be used more in sort of local or regional kind of cases where it's particularly important to be able to sort of talk to or access members of the target group directly, and where people have the ability and there's a system in place for people to sort of recruit other people through their network, which again is not always going to be the case. Okay, so here's an overview of the process of how it works. So let's say Tyler, a researcher who's a researcher, decides to do an RDS survey of particularly hard to reach researchers. So he knows Margaret from a previous intervention with this particular population. So again, here Margaret is acting as the convenient sample. So she's somebody who's already had an interaction with the researcher. So that person or that group of people are referred to as seeds. Margaret receives an incentive for participating, for answering a survey, or engaging in other types of activities with the researcher. So that's called the primary incentive. And then she's given 3 coupons to recruit other members of the population of interest. So Margaret knows David. So Margaret gives a coupon to David, and this coupon has a unique ID. So then David comes in and completes the survey. He also gets coupons, so the process repeats. Now David gets, when he completes the survey, he gets a primary incentive. But typically the way it works in RDS studies is that since David was recruited by Margaret, and we know that because of the coupon, the unique ID on the coupon, Margaret also gets what's called a secondary incentive because David came and participated. And so the way that this is typically structured is that people are incentivized both to engage themselves and to recruit other people from their network. There's obviously sort of heterogeneity in exactly how this is implemented and the situations when this may or may not be appropriate. But this is the sort of typical RDS setup. So David distributes the coupons. So now he's going to be starting what's called a new wave, a new set of coupon distribution in RDS. And then eventually no more coupons come back. So either everybody in the population has been reached, or maybe they haven't. Maybe they, just sort of, the incentive wasn't quite right. So the sort of, the incentive wasn't quite right, or the circumstances for participation weren't quite right. So people didn't feel comfortable, or maybe, for other reasons, the change just completely stops and no more coupons come back. So that's what we refer to as a chain, that entire wave of referrals. And so this is a picture from a paper by Carl Rove from 2015 that I think does a really nice job of showing you what's actually happening in respondent-driven sampling. So I should say here, on the right-hand side is what we actually see at the end. This is the sampling tree. So each dot here is a person, and the arrows represent recruitment. So that's what we actually see. We actually see this sampling tree. Now, what's underneath though if you look now to the far left, we'll go across the page from left to right. So we start with a seed node. So that's this red node here. And the network of potential contacts of the seed node is sort of in the grayed out black, the black and white here. And so that's what the researcher doesn't observe. So in the first wave, the person goes and recruits 2 other people. Then those 2 people recruit more people. In this case, the person at the top recruited only 1 other person. The person at the bottom recruited 2 more. And in the third wave, those second wave people are able to do recruitment again. And so again, there's this sort of highly complicated, highly structured process of the social network happening in the background that we don't observe. And we really don't have any control over as researchers. Now, layered on top of that, there's a highly structured, highly complicated, social, psychological, economic, and a process by which people go through thinking about who they're going to recruit, and then actually going through and making those recruitments. And that's happening on the top to generate the tree, to generate the actual referrals. And so these 2 processes sort of happening together are what generate the data that we see on the right-hand side, which is the sampling tree. And so this is, of course, a very complicated, confluence of behaviors and situations that produce the sampling tree. So here's a couple of examples from some published papers and a resource by Lisa Johnstone, that I've referenced at the end and given the link to again at the end if you want to see that. These are a couple of examples of respondent-driven sampling recruitment trees. So you have the blue nodes here are the seeds. And so each seed here has the possibility of recruiting up to 2 people. And you can see how that kind of goes out until the chain sort of finish. And you can see that some of the arms of the chain, some of the branches of the tree go farther than others. And that's just because the coupons stop at different places with different people. So what can we learn with respondent-driven sampling? So we can estimate characteristics of a group, so fractions. So if we're doing respondent-driven sampling with sex workers, then we say, we want to ask about, we could ask about or even potentially do seroprevalence tests for HIV positive status. So we can learn about features of the group, because again, we do have sort of access to individuals in the group. We can also use respondent-driven sampling to estimate the size or prevalence of the group overall in the population. I'll talk about this in a minute. This is a bit of a newer area in the last 4 or 5 years or so. And we can also assess a representative sample of group members. So for an intervention, for an experiment, for a detailed ethnography, that sort of thing. And so, again, I've sort of highlighted this before, but a real advantage of respondent-driven sampling is that it's going to let you learn about, it's going to let you kind of go beyond size estimation, right? And it's going to let you learn about the sort of experiences that people have because you can interact with them directly. But of course, that comes with the additional challenges of the recruitment process. Okay, so the big idea here, and the reason why you do this is that that the convenient sample is sort of obviously not representative. But the idea is that if you move away from the convenient sample through the networks of individuals under a certain set of assumptions, which I'll talk about in just a minute, you should eventually reach what's called a stationary distribution, which just means that the distribution of people in the RDS sample should look like the distribution in the population. So this is a way to sort of start from a convenient sample and essentially work through people's networks and end up with what should look like a representative sample from the population. And again, that's appealing because it means that if you want to understand, a representative set of experiences or a representative set of characteristics, that's something that's possible under assumptions. Okay, here's another example recruitment chains, just to break up the fact that I have a couple slides with text, with lots of text in the back-to-back, and to give you another example. So the last example I showed had two very, very long chains. This, I think, is a bit more typical, at least in my experience, where you have more seeds, and some of those seeds turn into very long chains. So like the ones on the far left and the far right here. Some of those seeds do not. They sort of don't go as far. So this, I think, is, at least in my experience, a bit more typical of what we see in doing RDS in practice, is that you end up with these, with a few seeds that produce very, very long trees, and a lot of seeds that don't as much. Okay, so some practical considerations. The coupons have to have a unique ID, so that you mostly understand the recruitment process. Again, this has sort of implications for the types of settings where this is going to be appropriate, right? I mean, the coupons are often physical things, and they need to be sort of, they need to be unique in a way, so that the research team knows the sort of the process. As I'll talk about later, the way that recruitment happens is actually really important for some of the statistical models that underlie this. But again, if a coupon is a physical thing, that a person takes with them, it's only going to be sort of reasonable to do this in settings where, people have a degree of privacy where they're going to be able to reasonably expect to have this and not raise suspicions, for example. So coupons have a unique ID. There's a trade-off between more coupons per person, which means you have fewer waves, and the risk of a chain sort of dying out too fast. And overall, the big sort of picture here is that, the respondent is sort of the one who's in charge of who they recruit. So the incentives really matter. The way that you sort of set up these primary and secondary incentives really matters for the structure of the process, because the respondent is ultimately the person that's making that decision. Okay, so this is just an example of, oh, sorry, was there somebody? No, sorry. So this is just an example of what coupons look like from some work by Hip and colleagues in 2019. So this, of course, is not, there are variations on this, but just to give you a sense of how this works, you can see the key thing here is a coupon number, so an identification number, a reminder to bring the coupon to the survey, the hours when the survey location's open, and then directions to get to the survey location. And so again, this is, this is sort of predicated. Typically, these are done with sort of physical in-person interactions. And so this is sort of predicated on the idea that it's with a group of people that have enough autonomy to sort of be able to do that. Okay, so let me just give you an example. This is from a paper from 2014, estimating labor trafficking among unauthorized migrant workers in San Diego, from the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. And so I've pasted and highlighted some parts here. So this paper applies respondent-driven sampling and unique access to migrant communities in San Diego County, California. Again, this is local because respondent-driven sampling is requiring individuals to sort of connect with each other, in this case physically. And so, so this is not going to be sort of a national level estimation strategy. This is a local thing. They found that 30% of undocumented migrant laborers were victims of labor trafficking, 55% were victims of other labor abuses, and about half of these victimization experiences happened in the last 12 months. And the rate of trafficking violations varied markedly across business sectors that typically hire unauthorized migrant workers. And again, I include this because it gives you a flavor of the kinds of things that you can learn with respondent-driven sampling. So the first statement here are the sort of the percentage or the context kind of questions. So 30%, 55%, estimating the fraction of the target population that's experiencing something. So in this case, the undocumented migrant laborers. And then the second comes from actually regression models. So again, sort of getting a sense of what the beyond the sort of sense of, beyond this question of, how many individuals, and looking at the sort of characteristics and situations. So how did this actually happen? So this is from the same paper. I wanted to just give you a sense of how this actually, how these studies are actually carried out in practice. So the study relies on staff members from a community partner, the Center for Social Advocacy, to initiate the responses. And again, this is the sort of convenient sample, right? So they're initiating the sampling process with individuals who have had interactions with this Center for Social Advocacy before, and they have the level of trust with this organization. So this is, of course, going to be not a representative sample, but is a sample that that's a group of individuals that's easier to access. And then there's sort of training and that sort of thing with enumerators. And then the study spans for a period of 77 weeks. There were a total of 16 interview sites throughout the county, and a total of 18 seeds that were used for the initial recruitment. So again, this is fairly standard in terms of, at least what I've seen for respondent-driven sampling. These are fairly time and data and, in some cases, money-intensive things to do. This is a sort of multiple month endeavor, and 16 interview sites and 18 seeds, so 18 potential waves of recruitment. Okay, again, I mentioned this before, but this is the sort of this is just to sort of highlight again the kinds of things that you learn from respondent-driven sampling. You can, this paper doesn't do it, but some of the newer, because the methods to estimate size from population size from respondent-driven sampling are kind of after this was published, but this paper doesn't do it. But you can sort of estimate size of a group with respondent-driven sampling, but the main emphasis is often on these sort of contextual questions. So 58% of unauthorized migrant laborers currently in the workforce in San Diego County have experienced at least one type of trafficking violation or abuse in practice, right? And so that's a statement that's written intentionally to sort of imply representativeness, which is what RDS is going to be able to, nominally offer. Okay. So I'll just briefly here in the last few minutes talk through some of the assumptions as well as the methodology. So the main assumptions, which are sometimes plausible, is that members of the population can be reached through their network. Again, I mentioned that before. That's the sort of key assumption here. Also that the respondents' network sizes are known. That's something that we have pretty good estimates of. And so that's something that's, again, often reasonable. The next is that the sort of things that are hard to do in practice is that I mentioned there's this kind of idea that eventually, if you go long enough, you'll end up in a situation where you have a group that looks representative. That's hard to do in many cases in practice, just for feasibility reasons. Sampling with replacement, which means that you can recruit the same person more than once. Typically there's a desire not to have that happen, just for efficiency, but that's what's needed in the from a statistical perspective. And then the last one that's rarely possible in practice, I mentioned this with the incentives, is that there's an assumption that respondents are recruiting randomly from all of their friends. And that's typically not what happens. And we can talk more offline, or I'm happy to talk more later about sort of ways that people have tried to address that. So when does this really go wrong? This goes wrong when there's bottlenecks in the network. That means it's impossible to sort of traverse from one part of the network to the other. When the sample size approaches the total population size, then it gets hard to think about inference. Of course, you don't know that the sample size is close to the population size. If you knew the sample size was close to the population size, then that'd be great. But of course, you don't know that. highly preferential recruitment, which is again this idea that people are sort of only recruiting a certain type of person out of their network. That can lead to some of these, exacerbate some of these bottleneck kind of ideas. And then chain stop with too few waves. Okay, I'll just mention here briefly, in my last two slides, two things that are the two big points about estimation. At a very high level, the two types of estimators that we often use with RDS, one has to do with estimating, again, this sort of fraction of a group that has a particular characteristic. The way that we do that is by adjusting for the probability of a person, adjusting for the sampling probability. And the sampling probability here, since the sampling is happening through the network, the sampling probability depends on how many contacts a person has. So if I have lots and lots of contacts, then there's lots of opportunities for me to be recruited into the sample. And if people with lots of contacts are different in other ways, in particular in ways that are related to the outcome that you're interested in, that's going to create an issue. And so we use a Horvitz-Thompson type estimator to estimate the fraction of individuals that have a particular characteristic, where the adjustment, it can get more complicated, but the adjustment at a high level depends on the number of connections a person has in the network, because that's how many opportunities they have to get recruited. Similarly, if you're thinking about size estimation, then the sort of main intuition for how you estimate the size, the number of people with a particular group using respondent-driven sampling, is that the characteristics of the people you're recruiting tell you something about how many people are left to recruit. So again, if you have lots and lots of connections, you're likely to be recruited early on because there's lots of opportunities to recruit you. So if you look at sort of how many connections people have as you go across the chains, if you move out of a world where you're recruiting people who have lots and lots of connections into a sort of regime where you're recruiting people with fewer and fewer connections, then there's a sense that you're probably getting towards you're probably sort of moving towards a case where you're starting to sort of transition in terms of the kinds of the parts of the network that you're recruiting from, and then you can sort of use that to learn about how many people are in the population total. So again, this sort of high level intuition is that we expect to recruit more popular people first, because there's more chances to reach them. And so when the degree drops, we're sort of getting out of that range of popular people, and we can use the sort of the way that changes to estimate the size of the population. Again, these are sort of more recent methods that have been developed since 2017, 18, 19 kind of until now. So most of the work that's out there currently in the context of trafficking combines RDS with another method, so capture, recapture, or something like that. Okay, so just to quickly summarize, RDS provides a way to access groups that are socially connected and have some ability to move freely. RDS provides access to group members and is typically used in sort of geographically and localized settings to understand characteristics or to estimate size. And then uncertainty is a sort of persistent challenge here. I mean, there's lots and lots of challenges that we've talked about. This is a sort of statistical take on a few more. How do we actually think about sort of what we do with the estimators once we have them? How do we communicate uncertainty effectively, given that this is a sort of highly complicated process and highly complicated estimators? And sort of how do we foster engagement with the idea that more sophisticated methods are useful in some contexts, but can also exacerbate communication challenges. So that's it for me. I would be more than happy to chat more with folks, definitely during the breakouts today, but then also later. There's my email address. And I have in the slides a set of resources and references that you can look at more if you're interested in getting more information about these. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tyler. I really appreciate that. That was a masterful summary. The plan now is we're going to take a 10-minute break. There were some questions that came in for you, Tyler, and we've tried to field them. But if you look at the Q&A, you can see whether or not you like our answers. So,
David,
we shall return in 10 minutes.
David, can we return before 10 minutes and then take another 5-minute break after the next session? We'll take 2 5-minute breaks. So
that's fine, Jim. I'm not sure that you're looking at the same schedule that I was looking at, but that's
I
okay.
think I'm sharing it now. If we come back at 20 minutes after the hour, whichever
Okay.
time zone you're in, we'll have Rowland Seymour and Bernard Silverman's presentation, and then we'll take another 5-minute break before the breakout rooms.
Okay,
So
thanks.
you can hang on, and we'll turn on the videos when we're back. Let me make you visible first, David. Go ahead, David.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We are fortunate today to have Bernard Silverman and Rowland Seymour give a presentation on sort of capture-recapture methodology. Thank you.
Good evening. Sorry, I beg your pardon. It's the evening where I am. Good afternoon, everyone. We're not going to just talk about capture-recapture, as you'll see. So this is a joint presentation between my colleague Rowland and me. Next slide, please, Rowland. What we're going to do is actually give you a kind of tour through a whole range of different methods and ideas that we've been thinking about. Rowland's going to talk about the network scale-up method, which is a method we haven't heard about yet. He's going to talk about comparative judgment and also some work we've done together on looking at IP addresses for online exploitation. And then I'm going to talk about how can statistics, even if they're no good, contribute to public policy. There's a rude version of the fourth bullet point. Now, some of our presentation is a bit technical. Don't worry about that if you're not technically minded, because we'll try and explain in rough terms what's going on. And for those that want to see the technical details, we will give you lots of references and so on, either in the paper or if you get in touch with us afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rowland to start telling us about Network Scale Up, which was an interesting project.
Yes, thank you very much, Bernard. Really good to talk to everyone today, and interesting presentation so far, and they've really set the ground for what we're going to talk about today, which has been useful. And yeah, as Bernard says, we're going to talk about several different methods, and the idea is we're going to start by talking about measuring prevalence, and then each topic will be one step further removed from prevalence over time, because although prevalence is a really important tool, there are lots of other tools available that we can use then to inform policy. So yes, the first one is about network scale-up. And this is a project run by the International Justice Mission. They commissioned the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab to work on this project to measure the prevalence of trafficking to produce child sexual abuse material in the Philippines. And that project involved, it's still ongoing, I think they should be reporting in the next few months. They wanted a prevalence for the number of victims who have been trafficked and the number of traffickers, and it's based on a national household survey in the Philippines using the network scale-up method, but will also be bolstered by secondary data analysis. And on the right, I think you should be able to see a list of some of the project partners, and this is the really key point on this slide, and it's something that IJM deserve a lot of credit for. They set up this very impressive external advisory committee to support the work of this project, and they've been on board throughout the whole project. It started in 2019, I think, and that has been incredibly helpful. Someone in the Q&A right at the start asked, if there are lots of different definitions of trafficking, well, how do we best measure it? And this is something that we've actually worked with the advisory committee to look at, because the University of Nottingham is in the UK, the International Justice Mission is a US-based partnership or organisation. We're interested in trafficking in the Philippines. So there's already lots of different definitions there. We're also looking at, I think it was Margaret who said, traffickers can move much faster than the law. So even though we do have the legal definition of trafficking, we're also interested in what's the lived experiences of those who have been trafficked? What are the actual practicalities of trafficking? So how do we include that in our definition of what it means to be trafficked to produce child sexual abuse material? And then finally, the third part of that jigsaw is the statistical definition, or we want something that we can statistically measure. Although we might have the legal definition, that might not be something we can completely measure statistically. So then we have those three elements, the legal part, the lived experience and practical part, and the statistical part, all coming together. And we want something that's somewhere near the intersection of all of those. And that was really helpful, having all of those partners to then work out what is the definition we're going to work with. So once we had that definition, we then went about designing a survey method, and the method we chose was the network scale-up method. And that would be, our sampling frame there was a random sample of 3,000 households across the Philippines. And how network scale-up works is you ask people to how many people they know, how many people are in their social network, and then of those people, how many people are trafficking to produce child sex and exploitation material, or really how many people do they know who are carrying out the target behavior you're interested in. And we chose this method for several reasons. We didn't want to ask people about their own experiences. We found quite early on that we're unlikely to obtain reliable responses if we ask people directly if they're trafficking or if they're victims of trafficking, because they might not identify as that. They might not want to say if they're traffickers. Very unlikely to say if they're traffickers. And so, yeah, asking directly is not something we wanted to do. But we found that there's a large body of literature on trafficking in the Philippines already, lots of qualitative work there. And also through the advisory committee, again, we quickly established that there's lots of community level information about trafficking to produce child sex exploitation material in the Philippines. People seem to know what's happening in their community and how many people are practicing this around them. And so we wanted a survey method that can tap into that. So that's why we chose network scale-up. So let me talk a bit more actually about how network scale-up works. So yeah, as I said, there are two parts. The first part is how many people does each person know? And then the second part is how many people they know who are exhibiting the target behavior. So in this case, trafficking to produce child sexual exploitation material. And this has been used fairly commonly in public health. So an example of that is men who have sex with men, or injecting drugs. And that's because it avoids asking people about their own situation. We're asking them about how many people do you know who do have this target behavior. So we're not asking about their own experiences at all, which is good for both the respondent. It puts, there's some safety in that because they're not identifying anything about themselves. And also because, actually, I think I'm going to talk about this. Yeah, because we are not asking about names, we're not saying who do you know, just how many people do you know. We're also putting the survey, or the people who are asking the survey, they're giving them some protection as well, so they don't end up with any compromising information either. So there's an element of safety for both parts there, which is particularly important when thinking about designing surveys for trafficking and modern slavery. And then the advantage of that is we can layer that with secondary data sets. And the network scale-up method can be very flexible. So you can combine this with lots of other survey techniques as well. So you might want to ask some direct questions, which is how many people do you know who are exhibiting the target behavior? Or you might want to ask indirectly. So you might have a list of 4 or 5 behaviors, and then you have a treatment group, which sees 4 or 5 behaviors and the target behavior. So you might include trafficking in that, and then a control group who see just the 4 or 5 behaviors you have, and they don't see the trafficking. So then you can look at the difference between the treatment and the control group to come up with the prevalence estimate there. So network scale up, you can be very flexible with that, which is a really nice advantage of that method. So yeah, as I said, there's lots of advantage to doing network scale up because, or survey work here, because we can then analyze secondary data. And again, just to go back to the International Justice Institution and their advisory council, there were 24 partners there from lots of different sectors. That is both the government and also private companies, international companies, who were able to provide data about customers and behaviors, so we can layer that on top and do some more traditional non-survey data science work to look at how, if there are any behaviors or if there are any patterns in the data sets that we can then layer on top with the survey results from the network scale up. So we can learn about different kinds of sector data and how that relates to trafficking to produce child sexual exploitation material. So yeah, that was a really good advantage of having that external advisory committee. Just being able to access that data and then work with them over the course of the project to really understand that data and get to grips with it. And then finally, going into the last stage of the project, the advisory committee there is great because we've been working with them for 2 years now. So we're ready to share the results with them, so then we can go and disseminate those widely and we can understand how those results impact each sector. So that's, although there's lots of nice maths and statistics in this, really what I wanted to stress is working with stakeholders throughout the whole project, from developing the research questions, to accessing data, to trying to understand the results, so sharing emerging findings, through to finally disseminating and then acting on the results. That's a really crucial part of this work, and we found that to be really help us with the project throughout lots of different stages. So yeah, as I said, we are going to talk about several different methods today in our talk, and each time go one step away from prevalence. So network scale up is about prevalence. The final goal is to have a number of victims with some uncertainty around that, of people who've been trafficked. But prevalence estimates, especially when you're doing things at a national scale or a large regional scale, can be very expensive and very time consuming to do. So what happens if you don't have the resources to do that, or maybe you're not at the stage yet where you want to have a prevalence estimate? And so one method for doing some work that's not quite prevalence, everything is relative, is comparative judgment. So to give you an idea, I'll just skip to the results straight away. The map here on the right, this is a map of Nottinghamshire, which is a county in the UK. And again, we did some survey work here, but this is about, we ended up with a heat map of where victims of a particular form of modern slavery are. And so yeah, each ward is color coded by the risk. So the red areas are the highest risk, the blue areas are the lowest risk areas. And as I said, this isn't prevalence, everything is relative here. So with slightly broader brushstrokes, but we found it to be a very useful tool for then really understanding what's going on and then building up momentum to go from there. And so how does comparative judgment work? Quite different to network scale up. Because we're not interested in prevalence. Instead, what happens is you show people pairs of areas and you say area A or area B, which has a higher rate of trafficking. And you do that lots and lots of times, and from those comparisons, you can then build up this heat map. So it's much easier to carry out. The design is much more straightforward, and so yeah, cheaper and faster to carry out.
But if I may interrupt, it's not so clear what it actually means, but you keep going.
Yes, this is the thing.
Yeah.
You don't get prevalence estimates at the end.
You get something or
nice
other.
heat maps, but
you get something or other. Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, although the advantage is that it's cheaper, the disadvantage is that yes, you don't get prevalence
I know what
estimates.
you're actually measuring, yeah.
So this is just the one case study already that we've done. We've done 3 of these now, and this is a map of Nottinghamshire. That's a county in central England. About 750,000 people live there. And that's a map of forced marriage at ward level. So this is the first time that there's been any local level information about forced marriage in the UK, at least, especially Nottinghamshire. And that's because there are lots of different agencies in the UK who support victims of forced marriage. But they're all quite disjoint, and none of them have the full picture. So being able to carry out a survey was really useful at collecting lots of different opinions there. Kind of the idea here, again, one weakness of comparative judgment is we're collecting lots of anecdotal data and hoping that the sum of anecdotal data is something meaningful. And the people who we managed to ask were members of Nottinghamshire Modern Slavery Partnership. So in the UK, the Modern Slavery Partnerships, there's one in each county, and they also deal with forced marriage. They have forced marriage as a form of modern slavery. And so they are people who support victims, so they should in theory know where victims are and where are high-risk areas. So yes, we're just showing them pairs of areas and asking them which areas have higher rates of forced marriage. And this has gone down very well. We've found, because this is the first time it's been carried out, lots of people in the county are using this to really then build interventions. Politicians are using this research in Parliament to really try to get the government to collect better data about forced marriage. So yeah, it's been very successful, even though it's not prevalence, even though we only have this heat map and we know everything relatively, but we don't know any particular, the prevalence in any particular ward. This is some maths just to show you how it works, but in broad terms, what happens is, if you have 2 areas...
I'm worried we're running out of time.
Oh, are we? Sorry, I'll skip through the maths.
Can we just tell people there's some maths there? Go back a bit so you can see it. So back one. And then there is some maths behind this. It's not just pulled out of the air, and anyone that's interested should look at the slides afterwards and read it. I think that's the best thing, don't you? I think otherwise we'll run out of time. Yeah, okay.
Exactly. There's a very nice paper as well, which goes through all of this. But still lots of work. You can take this idea further. You can do some clustering, so you can cluster together wards. That works quite well. Experimental design. How do we best ask these questions, especially when there aren't many people in Nottinghamshire who know about forced marriage? How do we best extract the information from them? How do we collect informative comparisons? And then how good are the actual people at giving us data? Are there any participants who are doing odd things or answering the questions in odd ways? So yeah, lots of further work there as well. I will talk about this one quite briefly because I know Bernard is keen to talk about his work. But this is, again, one step even further back from prevalence. So here we're just talking about behaviours. Instead of saying how many victims are there, we're trying to say what are the behaviours of victims and offenders. And we have access to a large data set of IP addresses associated with people accessing material related to the online sexual exploitation of children. So often these children are trafficked to produce this kind of material. And so we have all of these IP addresses. What can we then say about the behaviors? Again, we don't know how many IP addresses there are in total. Lots of IP addresses and users don't get reported for this. But let me skip to the big flowchart. What we can do then is build a flowchart that changes over time to try and model these behaviors. So IP addresses might join the community, that's the top left, and then they are active, they're accessing material from children who have been trafficked. Some of them will be observed, some of them won't be observed. So sometimes people will be reported for accessing material, sometimes they won't. If they are reported for accessing material, sometimes action will be taken to block the user, or maybe law enforcement will be involved in physical space, in real life, to arrest the user, but sometimes no action is taken because there's so much data being generated, it's not possible
usually, actually, but anyway,
to deal with all of that. So yes, and then we can then understand what are the transition rates. So how are things changing? How do people go act in this space? How do people behave each month? How many people? And we can try and then look at what are the behaviors and quantify them. Again, just to say, we can write down some maths to really understand this and work out, then have some kind of data and quantify the rates of how people behave and how people change their behaviors. But there are lots of issues there about IP addresses and about how good our model is that Bernard and I are now exploring. So that brings an end to my section. So I'll hand over to Bernard now.
Right, now I'm going to be asking Rowland. So my section is, what do you do if your statistics are no good, but can you still get a contribution to public policy? Next slide, please. So I want to tell you a bit about Florence Nightingale. So many of you will know these charts, which represent they're histograms. They were written in the 19th century. They're histograms which are in a rows. They're called rose diagrams, and they represent on the right the death rates in the Crimean War before Florence Nightingale got her ideas going and after. Now, this was a fantastic use of statistics to do some really good work, but it turns out that what Florence Nightingale was actually pushing was what she called hygiene, with a grave E, which meant opening the windows, washing out the water, being clean. And the doctors didn't like it because they thought that disease was spread by contagion, not by dirt or bad air. And Florence Nightingale thought, oh, no, it's fresh air and better drainage that does it. Next slide, please. The point is that she was wrong. Disease is spread by contagion, and all the fresh air and cleanliness and so on actually reduced the amount of contagion. So she was absolutely wrong scientifically, but her reforms, her changes made a fantastic difference. And the diagram was the start of a campaign for public health legislation. It led to something in Britain called the Public Health Act 1875, which was against opposition from the medics. And the Public Health Act said things like houses should be connected to good drainage, there should be a bit of space between homes, people should live better, and it saved millions of people from fatal epidemic disease and started, the amazing improvement in life expectancy long before medics really knew very much at all. But we're statisticians, not medics, so we'd like to say that. Next, please. Now, I was involved in bringing in the UK's Modern Slavery Act 2015, and I did some work using multiple systems estimation to estimate the number of victims in the United Kingdom. In 2013, the Home Office or the government knew about 2,700 potential victims, and they were reported from various sources as grouped in the table. People who are used to this subject, I trot this one out all the time. And what I did with Kevin Bales was to apply multiple systems estimation to estimate number of cases that weren't known, and that gave a confidence interval of 10 to 13,000 victims. Now, what matters about this is not how we did it, but you can read about that, but what happened. The figure hit front page headlines. It was in all the newspapers, and it was absolutely pivotal in bringing the issue to public attention. Everyone went around saying there's a lot of victims of this in the country, far more than we thought, and so it stimulated the passing of the act and also a spur to action. And there's now enormous public consciousness of the issue. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see what's happened. So this is the number of referrals to the government's national referral mechanism over the last, over 2014 to 2019. And I don't think this is because there are more victims, it's because there's more awareness of victims, and this was all brought about by the statistical work that exposed this number in the first place. It also demonstrates that the original figure of 10 to 13,000 was extremely conservative, which I knew all along. And so it wasn't a very good statistical estimate, but it had an enormous impact. Next, please. Here's two examples of impact. On the left, there's something that came through my door in London, which is a free City Council newsletter. And it's basically saying, we've all got to do something about this. We're hosting 2 training sessions for community leaders and organisations, professionals, and so on and so on. When the Act was first being contemplated, I was working in the government as a chief scientific advisor at the time. I'd never really heard of modern slavery. I didn't know about it. And we've got from there, which is about bit more than 10 years ago, to now when everybody is aware, and this is really important. And on the right is a thing called a modern slavery statement. All large organizations in this country have to produce a statement, publish one, that's businesses, universities, government departments, authorities and so on, have to produce a statement saying what they are doing to eliminate modern slavery, human trafficking from their supply chains. And this is the thing. So if you read, it says, in accordance with section 54 of the Act, the university is required to prepare a slavery and human trafficking statement for every financial year, setting out what steps it's taken to ensure modern slavery isn't taking place in its business or supply chains. And so that's something else that every business has to do. Most of them actually do it, not quite all, but it's another example of awareness and of the fight against modern slavery. Next, please. Now, 2 more slides quickly. There's a thing called the Global Slavery Index, which is produced by an organization called Walk Free. And it was done like this. They produced vulnerability measures. These are not risk measures for individuals. These are risk measures for countries. And they did surveys in 48 countries to understand these vulnerability measures. And then what they did was to extrapolate them to other countries. So in the 48 countries, by methods we've already heard about, they got actual numerical estimates of prevalence. And then they regressed those on these vulnerability measures, and then they extrapolated to countries like my country and your country, the UK and the USA, with really no data on that sort of country at all. And actually, if you look at the statistics, it's terrible because the standard errors are larger than the values. So for the UK, they say it's 0.38%, which is a ludicrously high percentage, by the way. And the standard error is nearly as large as that, and similar figures for the US, other Western European countries. So here's a statistical method which really doesn't produce very good individual prevalences. But what it does do is it identifies risks and vulnerabilities. Now, these are not individual risks, these are societal risks. So it's things like having a good legal system, having a good reporting mechanism, having a democratic government. All these are factors which reduce the risk. And so that's the kind of thing. Next slide. And this is something that's really off the wall in my view, which is some work done where they did natural language processing on police notebooks. And they discovered that they thought there were 10 times as many cases as the police actually thought there were. And they did it just by looking for words like slavery and trafficking. You didn't need artificial intelligence to find those. And it's not clear why there's so many. But the approach suggested a very unrealistic number of cases, an implausible result, but it still demonstrates that law enforcement may well miss cases that are hiding in plain sight. Next, please. I think that's the end. Rowland and I will both chip in. Prevalence estimates are very useful. Generating them is expensive and time-consuming, and there's a lot of very interesting work needs to be done, and you've seen some of it, to get this going better. I'm not suggesting prevalence estimate is not useful. It's very useful, very difficult, and there you are. Layering of data sets. Do you want to say something about that, Rowland?
Yes, if you do or do not have prevalence estimates, but you can still layer data sets to tell you interesting things about behaviours of people, whether that be victims, survivors, or traffickers themselves, offenders. Layering them can give you a really good insight into behaviours. Do you want to pick up the next point, Bernard?
Yes, indeed. Now, if you have results which have uncertainty and limitations, you have to find ways of explaining them to policymakers, and you have to help them use the numbers appropriately. And so let me give an example. I would not want the police, and I've heard this suggested, to say Bernard Silverman said there were between 10 and 13,000 victims. So we found 12,500 victims, so we need to find the next 500 and then the job's done. I would want the police to say, there's a large number here. Maybe the number's not very good. They need to understand both the advantages and the limitations of the data. And my experience with policymakers is that they're very happy to do this, but they just need support to know how to use numbers correctly. And the other thing is explaining caveats is difficult. So propagandist policymakers will tend to leave out all the caveats. And so you have to give them the data in such a way that they don't get to get out of what we call a get out of jail free card for the caveats. They still should be aware of them, but it mustn't be too complicated for them. Yes, we will make sure. I think the presentation slides are going to be given out, and if not, I will put them on my website. So, Christian, if you email me look for bernardsilverman.co.uk and email me my contact form, I will send them to you. And then finally, what should we do? This is an ethical question for statisticians. If I know that my estimates are wildly inaccurate, what do I do? So suppose my estimate is 20,000, but the confidence interval is from 10,000 to 100,000. If I said that to a policymaker, they would say, so you don't know anything, do you? It's not true. And so we need to find a way of presenting exploratory conclusions without discrediting ourselves, without telling statistical lies about accuracy, but understanding that they can still have great positive impact. So is it unethical to produce an estimate knowing that the estimate is very, very inaccurate indeed? Or where there are caveats that are in the small print or something like that? Or is it the thing that you need to do in this kind of very important area? Rowland, is that the end of I think that's the last slide.
Yeah, that's the last slide. Thank you very much.
Anything to add it, but I'd just like to thank you all for your attention and look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Rowland, Bernard, thank you both so much for this. This was a wonderful presentation. According to our schedule, we'll now have an opportunity for all the panelists to sort of speak to each other, addressing the points that each of you have made. So if you will all unmute and chat, that would be great. There are a number of questions in the Q&A, and some people may want to address them.
Can I ask the organisers a question? Are you going to make all the slides available to everyone immediately after the meeting?
We will post them on our website where the event is announced on this/events, or in a few hours it'll be past events, and we'll post it there.
Right. So I don't have to. So that answers Christina's question, or whoever it was that asked it. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And David, I'm going to spotlight all the speakers, and so they should all be visible during the next 10 or 15 minutes of discussion. And then we're going to take another 5-minute break where we'll actually go off the webinar and come back as a meeting so that everyone can see everyone and join the breakout rooms. So
good.
So let's see, I think we have everyone on the screen except Megan Price. Do you want to turn on your video and I'll spotlight you? There we go.
There were some questions that came up in the Q&A, and I've don't seem to have my Q&A button anymore.
Oh,
Megan, Glenn, or Jim, can you bring those up and make sure that they are addressed?
Actually, could I answer a question, which is the one that you and Rowland have been discussing? I agree. I think that the Nottingham data was a bit odd, because I suspect, as Rowland has said, that the people being asked to make the comparisons didn't quite understand the difference between a number and a ratio. Is that possible, Rowland? So that they...
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree with that. We did all of this work remotely, and we did try to explain to them in text that we were looking for ratios, but again, how much people understood of that, not sure.
I think if you say, is there more crime in one area than another, some people will normal. Of course, the other thing is the wards ought to all have the same population, so that the wards in principle have the same population. But of course, in a city, people will naturally think there's more. So that probably is why I made that quip about it's a wonderful way of summarizing all the expert opinion, but we don't know what you're really doing. But yeah. I mean, I think it's an existence proof. It shows that a method like this can be useful. Although I did notice with the forced marriage that there was one ward that was separate from the others where there was a bit more. So yeah.
Forced marriage, of course, is associated with certain cultural traditions and norms, and so it may be that that's also involved with this.
Yeah,
this
it
mapping.
could be. Yes, it could simply be a reflection of the ethnic or religious makeup of.
We looked at that. We looked at the ethnic, ethnicity, and also deprivation, because we thought that people might be telling us where deprived people live, but that didn't seem to be the case in either way. So. There are some interesting results there, as well as the fact that a lot of it's driven by population size.
Yeah.
Hyla, there was a question that came up during your talk about whether there are practical challenges from handing out coupons that could lead to discovery and outing people who are responding to the survey.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think this is, and I was sort of saying a little bit of this in the chat. And I mean, I think this is sort of one of the reasons why, lots of the indirect methods like network scale up were sort of, are used in this context. I mean, I definitely think that's absolutely a concern. And I think, and I think the person asking the question even mentioned phones too. I mean, there's sort of ways that, you could think about with technology trying to, minimize this risk, but like absolutely sort of the potential for that risk is definitely a paramount concern.
I could imagine ways around it. For example, it might be that you have each person is a code word and you add one number to the end of it for each new response.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it could be just carried in your head.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think there's I think there's an interesting question of like, if you kind of have, depending on how the rest of the RDS data collection is set up, it's maybe not as critical that exactly where the recruitments are coming from. If you have, context and you have geographically separated areas, then, you can imagine situations where, sort of knowing, you don't need to know exactly, Tyler recruited David or David recruited Tyler, but like, okay, well, this happened roughly this time, roughly this area. So like something where you're saying where it sort of narrows it down to, a few people is probably enough. So yeah, I was thinking of exactly something like what you said, David, where you sort of say, here's a code word or something.
There's a new Q&A thing that popped up. Can you speak a little more about how you use secondary data, what type of data, to improve prevalence estimates using such methods as NSUM?
There's until the results come out, I'm a bit limited about what exactly I can say about the secondary data, but it spans several sectors from looking, so in the list of publicly available data organizations we worked with, Meta are in there, PayPal are in there, several government organizations, so we're trying to span different sectors there. And then to answer your second question, that's the really interesting part, I think, as well as telling us about behaviors. When we're doing the layering, one thing we might want to do is if we run a survey and collect the data in one region or one country, the survey is often quite expensive and impractical to do. So can we then use that information we've learned from the layering to take it across to another region? So without having to do the survey, but then you end up in the issues Bernard was pointing about how many statistical assumptions are you willing to break in order to do that, and how reliable and good will your answers will be?
Thank you. Nancy and Margaret, there are some questions that came up during your presentation, but I think one of the sort of overarching themes is what types of methodology would work well in different types of trafficking, because there are many kinds of trafficking, and I don't think there's one answer that fits all.
I'm going to defer to Nancy on this one.
Well, actually, I think that's one of the questions for our small group discussions. We can take it up now if you'd like as a whole, or
I'd like to make sure that we have the question sort of well framed, and if you could give me some examples about what might work well with child trafficking, or what would be the challenges in child trafficking, what would be the challenges in forced labor, things like that.
Can I have a go?
Please.
One of the challenges is you have to think of all the reasons why the victims don't come forward. And one very difficult challenge is when the victim is themselves involved in criminal behavior. In other words, the behavior that the victim is carrying out is itself illegal, because some forms of trafficking, if it is not illegal to clean your office in the middle of the night, but it is illegal if you're, in the United States, it's illegal to sell sexual services. It's not actually illegal in the UK. Or if you take there's a lot of trouble we have called county lines. It's about people using children to deliver drugs in rural areas. And again, and so it's very, very difficult when someone knows they've been trafficked, possibly, but they also know that they've committed a crime. So that's a very, very hidden. That's a very difficult one, and that's where you need really, really careful approaches. But I mean, I think to say that one method is better, because in a way, these things like network scale-up method and respondent-driven and multiple systems, they're all like tools, they're like screwdrivers and spanners and so on and so on. And they probably, what I think we really need to do is to understand whatever method you use will have the same, will run up against the same kind of difficulties, I feel. But the others may have other things to say.
well, I think another consideration is that if human trafficking as a crime of exploitation is often almost always marked by issues of power and control. So there are power differentials between a researcher and the person who's living the experience or has lived experience. And that's where prevalence or working with large data sets or trying to amass large sets of data can be really difficult and have a number of challenges that speak again to these power differentials between researcher, interviewer, perhaps the key informant, and the individual whose life and lived experience has been largely bound by a lack of agency or beholdenness to someone who's viewed as having or does reliably have more power and control. And so the reliability, the informed consent that we all strive for with our IRBs, and to, we don't want to do harm is not harm, or there's no, it's very difficult to attain parity when conducting this kind of research. And so there are other models, other mechanisms for doing it, but they tend to be local, like the use of narrative, participatory research, action-oriented research for starting, but in terms of engaging large populations or large sample sizes to determine prevalence, it's a challenge. We can get over it, and I'm sure the people on this call have a lot of ideas about how to do that, but I do want to raise that issue.
And my guess as not one of you people is this, that no matter what you think you want to research, your focus is going to have to be way more narrow than you ever dreamed of in order for it to actually generate reliable data, because of the variation that exists and because of the challenges that different delivery structures present for you, and frankly, different modes of controlling victims present within the dynamic as well.
I hate to sound like an economist, but one method that was discussed by the National Academies panel was looking at the price of forced labor. For example, if migrant labor is very, very expensive, then presumably there is not a lot of it in that region. However, if it's very cheap, then an economist would argue that there is lots of forced labor in that area. Is that something that any of the panelists would like to speak to?
So David, just to be clear, this is using the price as an indicator, right? So like,
Yes.
Yeah.
You could say the same thing for sex labor. If it's inexpensive, there are many people. If it's very expensive, there are few.
Well, I don't know, because I think that's very simplistic.
It is.
And you could make an argument that says if something's expensive, it's worth going to a lot of trouble to get it. So, you know, I think that it's yeah. I mean, I think economics is very important here. There's no doubt about it. But you could imagine that you know, there's also I'm not sure you've got the right economic argument, but I think it is worth looking at. It is. I mean, when I worked in the government, whenever you talked about organized crime and the police, they always said, "Oh, just always follow the money, always see where the money is where the money is, because that will tell you something," and it does. But I suspect that often, you know, I mean, yeah, because also if you look at the child sexual exploitation thing, it's only worth doing in the Philippines in a family if you're going to get a reasonable amount of money for it. So if the price is too low, sorry, if the price is low, then it's not worth doing this to your kids. They can go out and do something else instead. You know, so I'm not quite sure how the market works here, but it's a good point.
Well, perhaps another angle is that if a product or service is very expensive, it's also better protected within society, more untouchable within society.
Yeah, although actually if you look, I talked about supply chains. There is no particular evidence that expensive clothes are less likely to be made using slave labor in their supply chain than cheap ones. So just because a pair of jeans cost you $500 does not mean that someone in some other country was essentially exploited in forced labor to produce them. And so actually, although the cotton wasn't, you know, produced in a country where these things, you know, where people are forced to pick it and so on, and quite cheap shops actually go to quite a lot of trouble to make sure that their stuff is okay. So it's not quite clear, but the price itself doesn't tell you necessarily whether they actually put any resources into worrying about this. I mean, you know, there are plenty of examples of very wealthy people in America who've come unstuck because it turns out they employed undocumented people to look after their children, people who could well have afforded to pay proper wages to someone. But there you are. They don't.
Well, just speaking locally about one particular form of trafficking, I think it's a lot easier for law enforcement, for example, to go after acts of sex trafficking that involved a smaller price tag than the 4 or 5 digit price tags.
Oh,
there's a
yes.
whole lot more political will to prosecute, to investigate and prosecute those kinds. So that's my point. That's
Yes, of course. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Of course, of course. I think, yeah, that's right. No, I'm thinking about the things that, you know, you buy something in a store, in a shop, and you don't know, you know, how it was made, and so that's a different thing. Different
Yeah.
thing.
David, I'm watching the clock, and I think we should take another break for 5 minutes and then come back. And when we come back, we're going to actually close the webinar. When in 2 or 3 minutes, you should click on the same link and come back, as we'll be in a meeting. Everyone can see everyone. If there's any follow-up questions from this discussion, we can address them there before we go into the breakout rooms. Does that sound good?
Thank you so much. That sounds like
I
a plan.
will send a note to everyone. So we'll be back in 5 minutes, but we will log off right now and then log back on as a meeting. So see you soon. We will have each of the speakers in a separate room if we can engineer it. So. Events, or in a few hours it'll be past events, and we'll post it there.
Right. So I don't have to. So that answers Christina's question, or whoever it was that asked it. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And David, I'm going to spotlight all the speakers, and so they should all be visible during the next 10 or 15 minutes of discussion. And then we're going to take another 5-minute break where we'll actually go off the webinar and come back as a meeting so that everyone can see everyone and join the breakout rooms. So
Good.
So let's see, I think we have everyone on the screen except Megan Price. Do you want to turn on your video and I'll spotlight you? There we go.
There were some questions that came up in the Q&A, and I don't seem to have my Q&A button anymore.
Oh,
Megan, Glenn, or Jim, can you bring those up and make sure that they are addressed?
Actually, could I answer a question, which is the one that you and Rowland have been discussing? I agree. I think that the Nottingham data was a bit odd, because I suspect, as Rowland has said, that the people being asked to make the comparisons didn't quite understand the difference between a number and a ratio. Is that possible, Rowland? So that they...
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree with that. We did all of this work remotely, and we did try to explain to them in text that we were looking for ratios, but again, how much people understood of that, not sure.
I think if you say, is there more crime in some area, one area than another, some people will normal. Of course, the other thing is the wards ought to all have the same population, so that the wards in principle have the same population. But of course, in a city, people will naturally think there's more. So that probably is why I made that quip about it's a wonderful way of summarizing all the expert opinion, but we don't know what you're really doing. But yeah. I mean, I think it's an existence proof. It shows that a method like this can be useful. Although I did notice with the forced marriage that there was one ward that was separate from the others where there was a bit more. So yeah.
Forced marriage, of course, is associated with certain cultural traditions and norms, and so it may be that that's also involved with this.
Yeah,
this
it
mapping.
could be. Yes, it could simply be a reflection of the ethnic or religious makeup of.
We looked at that. We looked at the ethnic, ethnicity, and also deprivation, because we thought that people might be telling us where deprived people live, but that didn't seem to be the case in either way. So there are some interesting results there, as well as the fact that a lot of it's driven by population size.
Yeah.
Hyla, there was a question that came up during your talk about whether there are practical challenges from handing out coupons that could lead to discovery and find outing people who are responding to the survey.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think this is, you know, I mean, and I was sort of saying a little bit of this in the chat, and I mean, I think this is sort of one of the reasons why, you know, lots of the indirect methods like network scale up or sort of, you know, are used in this context. I mean, I definitely think that's absolutely a concern. And I think, you know, I mean, and I think the person asking the question even mentioned phones too. I mean, there's sort of ways that, you know, you could think about with technology trying to, you know, minimize this risk, but like absolutely sort of the potential for that risk is definitely a paramount concern.
I could imagine ways around it. For example, it might be that you have each person is a code word and you add one number to the end of it for each new response.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it could be just carried in your head.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think there's a good, I mean, I think there's an interesting question of like, you know, if you kind of have, I mean, depending on how the rest of the RDS data collection is set up, it's maybe not as critical that you know exactly where the recruitments are coming from. If you have, you know, context and you have geographically separated areas, then, you know, I mean, you could imagine situations where, you know, sort of knowing, you don't need to know exactly, you know, Tyler recruited David or David recruited Tyler, but like, okay, well, this happened roughly this time, you know, roughly this area. So like something where you're saying where it sort of narrows it down to, you know, a few people is probably enough. So yeah, I was thinking of exactly something like what you said, David, where you sort of say, here's a code word or something.
There's a new Q&A thing that popped up. Can you speak a little more about how you use secondary data, what type of data, to improve prevalence estimates using such methods as NSUM?
Yeah, there's until the results come out, I'm a bit limited about what exactly I can say about the secondary data, but it spans several sectors from looking, so in the list of publicly available data organizations we worked with, Meta are in there, PayPal are in there, several government organizations, so we're trying to span different sectors there. And then to answer your second question, that's the really interesting part, I think, as well as telling us about behaviors. When we're doing the layering, one thing we might want to do is if we run a survey and collect the data in one region or one country, the survey is often quite expensive and impractical to do. So can we then use that information we've learned from the layering to take it across to another region? So without having to do the survey, but then you end up in the issues Bernard was pointing about how many statistical assumptions are you willing to break in order to do that, and how reliable and good will your answers will be?
Thank you. Nancy and Margaret, there are some questions that came up during your presentation, but I think one of the sort of overarching themes is what types of methodology would work well in different types of trafficking, because there are many kinds of trafficking, and I don't think there's one answer that fits all.
I'm going to defer to Nancy on this one.
Well, actually, I think that's one of the questions for our small group discussions. We can take it up now if you'd like as a whole, or
I'd like to make sure that we have the question sort of well framed, and if you could give me some examples about what might work well with child trafficking, or what would be the challenges in child trafficking, what would be the challenges in forced labor, things like that.
Can I have a go?
Please.
One of the challenges is you have to think of all the reasons why the victims don't come forward. And one very difficult challenge is when the victim is themselves involved in criminal behavior. In other words, the behavior that the victim is carrying out is itself illegal, because some forms of trafficking, you know, if it is not illegal to clean your office in the middle of the night, but it is illegal if you're, you know, in the United States, it's illegal to sell sexual services. It's not actually illegal in the UK. Or if you take there's a lot of trouble we have called county lines. It's about people using children to deliver drugs in rural areas. And again, and so it's very, very difficult when someone knows they've been trafficked, possibly, but they also know that they've committed a crime. So that's a very, very hidden. That's a very difficult one, and that's where you need really, really careful approaches. But I mean, I think to say that one method is better, because in a way, these things like network scale-up method and respondent-driven and multiple systems, they're all like tools, you know, they're like screwdrivers and spanners and so on and so on. And they probably, what I think we really need to do is to understand whatever method you use will have the same, will run up against the same kind of difficulties, I feel. But the others may have other things to say.
Well, I think another consideration is that if human trafficking as a crime of exploitation is often marked, almost always marked by issues of power and control. So there are power differentials between a researcher and the person who's living the experience or has lived experience. And that's where prevalence or working with large data sets or trying to amass large sets of data can be really difficult and have a number of challenges that speak again to these power differentials between researcher, interviewer, perhaps the key informant, and the individual whose life and lived experience has been largely bound by a lack of agency or beholdenness to someone who's viewed as having or does reliably have more power and control. And so the reliability, the informed consent that we all strive for with our IRBs and to, you know, we don't want to do harm is not harm, or there's no, it's very difficult to attain parity when conducting this kind of research. And so there are other models, other mechanisms for doing it, but they tend to be local, like the use of narrative, participatory research, action-oriented research for starting, but in terms of engaging large populations or large sample sizes to determine prevalence, it's a challenge. We can get over it, and I'm sure the people on this call have a lot of ideas about how to do that, but I do want to raise that issue.
And my guess as not one of you people is this, that no matter what you think you want to research, your focus is going to have to be way more narrow than you ever dreamed of in order for it to actually generate reliable data, because of the variation that exists and because of the challenges that different delivery structures present for you, and frankly, different modes of controlling victims present within the dynamic as well.
I hate to sound like an economist, but one method that was discussed by the National Academies panel was looking at the price of forced labor. For example, if migrant labor is very, very expensive, then presumably there is not a lot of it in that region. However, if it's very cheap, then an economist would argue that there is lots of forced labor in that area. Is that something that any of the panelists would like to speak to?
So David, just to be clear, this is using the price as an indicator, right? So like,
yes.
Yeah.
You could say the same thing for sex labor. If it's inexpensive, there are many people. If it's very expensive, there are few.
Well, I don't know, because I think that's very simplistic.
It is.
And you could make an argument that says if something's expensive, it's worth going to a lot of trouble to get it. So, you know, I think that it's yeah. I mean, I think economics is very important here. There's no doubt about it. But you could imagine that you know, there's also, I'm not sure you've got the right economic argument, but I think it is worth looking at. It is. I mean, when I worked in the government, whenever you talked about organized crime and the police, they always said, "Oh, just always follow the money, always see where the money is where the money is, because that will tell you something," and it does. but I suspect that often, you know, I mean, yeah, because also if you look at the child sexual exploitation thing, it's only worth doing in the Philippines in a family if you're going to get a reasonable amount of money for it. So if the price is too low, sorry, if the price is low, then it's not worth doing this to your kids. They can go out and do something else instead. You know, so I'm not quite sure how the market works here, but it's a good point.
Well, perhaps another angle is that if a product or service is very expensive, it's also better protected within society, more untouchable within society.
Yeah, although actually a lot of, if you look, I talked about supply chains. There is no particular evidence that expensive clothes are less likely to be made using slave labor in their supply chain than cheap ones. So just because a pair of jeans costs you $500 does not mean that someone in some other country was essentially exploited in forced labor to produce them. And so actually, although the cotton wasn't, you know, produced in a country where these things, you know, where people are forced to pick it and so on. Quite cheap shops actually go to quite a lot of trouble to make sure that their stuff is okay. So it's not quite clear, but the price itself doesn't tell you necessarily whether they actually put any resources into worrying about this. I mean, you know, you've got there are plenty of examples of very wealthy people in America who've come unstuck because it turns out they employed undocumented people to look after their children, people who could well have afforded to pay proper wages to someone. But there you are. They don't.
Well, just speaking locally about one particular form of trafficking, I think it's a lot easier for law enforcement, for example, to go after acts of sex trafficking that involved a smaller price tag than the 4 or 5 digit price tags. There's a lot more political will to prosecute, to investigate and prosecute those kinds. So that's my point. That's
yes, of course. Yes, of course. Yes, absolutely, of course. I think that's right. No, I'm thinking about the things that, you know, you buy something in a store, in a shop, and you don't know, you know, how it was made, and so that's a different thing. Thing. Yeah.
David, I'm watching the clock, and I think we should take another break for 5 minutes and then come back. And when we come back, we're going to actually close the webinar. When in 2 or 3 minutes, you should click on the same link and come back, as we'll be in a meeting. Everyone can see everyone. If there's any follow-up questions from this discussion, we can address them there before we go into the breakout rooms. Does that sound good?
Thank you so much. That sounds like
I will send a note to everyone. So we'll be back in 5 minutes, but we will log off right now and then log back on as a meeting. So see you soon. We will have each of the speakers in a separate room if we can engineer it. So